Hello everyone and welcome to this video in which I'm going to be talking about 3 common problems in intercultural communication. Now, let's get right into it. First of all, I'm going to describe to you a little bit about these 3 common problems in intercultural communication. The first one is that we are always making assumptions when we are interacting with somebody from a different cultural environment. Now, the problem here is that while we are growing up, we are getting culturally conditioned in a certain way, to think in a certain way, and to act in a certain way, to behave in a certain way. And we are taking all these different assumptions with us when we're going to a different cultural environment. And then we find that actually these assumptions are not actually accurate in that particular environment. And this creates problems for us when interacting with local people. The second problem is that we are always stuck in our own cultural conditioning. Now, what this means is that, as I've said before, now we have always been ingrained by certain values, by certain assumptions, by certain worldviews, by certain behavioral patterns. These behavioral patterns have been ingrained into us from the time that we are a child. And that can create problems for us when we're coming to a different cultural environment, because we're always taking them with us wherever we're going. And other people, when they see us in the first time, for example, they will be quite surprised because, suddenly there's someone here right in front of me who is acting completely different from what I'm used to. Because from these people's perspective, who may have lived in their own country for most of their lives, suddenly there's someone who is breaking all these patterns that they have been so commonly used to. And this then leads to surprise and conflict and certain issues. Now, the third of the problems is that we are usually tending to have this belief that our own way of behaving is the best possible way of behaving. Now, why is this the case? Well, it's quite common and understandable, because from the time that we're children, the people around us were also holding these cultural beliefs that have been passed on to us, right? And these cultural beliefs, we're so used to them that they seem so natural to us that we think that, oh, it's quite obvious, this is the cultural behavior that is the most obvious to me, and this makes the most sense to me, and why is it that this other person does not understand them? So that is one of the biggest problems here. So now that we've discussed the 3 problems in intercultural communication, let's get a little bit into how we can solve these problems. Now, for the first problem is that, again, that we are always making assumptions about the behaviors of other people, and also about the way that our own behavior is perceived by the other people. Now, let's just assume that you are a human resources professional and that you're interviewing a Japanese job candidate. Now, this Japanese job candidate keeps looking down. He doesn't look directly at you. He seems quite quiet. He doesn't really engage with you the way that you're expecting it. He doesn't really ask questions from his own accord. He doesn't really show initiative from your perspective, because he doesn't really talk by himself. He always talks only when you're asking him a question. Now, you're assuming that this behavior shows a lack of confidence from his side. You're assuming that this behavior shows a lack of initiative from his side, because in your own cultural sphere, people who are displaying this behavior usually tend to have these characteristics. But what you haven't done here is to really go to some people who know the Japanese cultural environment and to ask them what is really behind this behavior, what is really the meaning behind this behavior in the cultural environment that this person is coming from, in this case, the Japanese cultural environment. So if you were going to do your research, you would quickly find out that in the Japanese culture, it is quite common for people who perceive themselves as lower in the social hierarchy to keep their eye contact low and to only speak when being spoken to by the superior, and to only ever ask questions or talk on their own accord when the superior is asking them to do so, because this is perceived as a sign of respect. So if you had done your research, you would have found out that this is actually the situation in the Japanese cultural environment, and so you could have understood that the assumption you're making about this particular individual was not correct. And I believe that this is a very important thing to do. We always need to get our research right. We always need to test our assumptions when we're going into a different cultural environment. And that can mean going around and asking people questions about this cultural environment. This can mean doing your research by reading on a website about it. This can mean reading in a book and so on and so forth. Though there's many different ways to do your research and test your assumptions. But the important thing is that we do it and that we do not just take our assumptions for granted. Now, what's the second common problem in intercultural communication? Well, the second common problem is that we are stuck in our own cultural conditioning, right? Now, we are stuck in our own cultural conditioning. What this basically means is that from the time that we have been growing up, we have learned these cultural behaviors and we have learned these cultural assumptions, these worldviews, and they've been so ingrained into us that we're not really aware of them, actually, that we're not really aware that these are actually cultural patterns. Now, one thing that we can do to solve this problem is to constantly go around and ask different people to give criticism about our behavior. Now, this might seem strange to you in the first time, but actually, if you think about it again, it makes a lot of sense. Because when we do a certain behavior in a certain circumstances, and we think that, okay, this behavior in the past has usually led me to these particular outcomes, and therefore I'm assuming that this will also again lead to the same outcomes in this new environment. And you think that everything is okay, but oftentimes it's not. So what you can do is you can go around to different people who are affected by the decisions that you have made, by the behavior that you have shown, and you can ask them how they themselves perceived that behavior. Or you can go to a third party who has some experience in that cultural environment, and you can ask them, how do you perceive that behavior that I've used in these circumstances? How would you have reacted to the behavior that I've shown in these circumstances? And what you'll find is that more often than not, the people actually react to your behavior quite differently than what you had expected in the first place. So you could have always been thinking about this question. How do other people perceive my behavior? How does my behavior come across to other people? Now, this is a very important question, and you should always get feedback from other people about how your behavior is working in that particular cultural environment. The third of the common problems in intercultural communication is that we are always going into another culture with the belief that our own behavior is the best possible behavior. And what we have to keep in mind here is that this is actually quite a common thing, because we have been growing up in a particular cultural environment, and because all the people in that cultural environment have acted in a certain way, there have been certain patterns that we have learned from the time that we were children and that have been ingrained into our psyche. So it's quite normal that we assume that this particular behavior is normal, and that we are surprised if other people are seeing it in a different way. But what we have to keep in mind here is that they themselves have their very own behavior that they perceive to be normal, and that can be quite a different thing from what you are used to. Now, in order to get a little bit into this, we have to understand where culture is actually coming from. Culture is basically something that has been developed in order to ensure human beings' survival. We have been passing on our ideas, our values, our assumptions, our worldviews, our skills, and different things that we have learned from one generation to the other, because in that particular environment and for that particular purpose, these have been the best behaviors to ensure our survival. So in that sense, All cultures have their very own reasons for existence. All cultures have their own history that have determined why they have developed in this particular way. And so what we have to develop in ourselves is basically this idea of cultural relativism, which states that all cultures are equal, all cultures are of equal value, all cultures have their very own reason for existence. So what we have to facilitate in our minds then is this idea that rather than having this belief in our head that my way of doing things is the best way, we have to keep in mind that all cultures, all particular cultural behaviors have their very own reason for existence, and they're all the best in one particular environment and for a particular purpose, right? So I always need to try to act in a way that leads to the best possible outcomes in this particular environment and for the particular purpose that I'm trying to achieve. Because once I'm focusing on the environment and the purpose, then it becomes obvious that my particular area might not necessarily be the best one. It can still be the best one, but often it is not. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. So now I want to hear from you. What are the typical problems that you have faced in intercultural communication? And please let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a good one. Bye bye.